Greetings, fellow readers and story lovers, and welcome back to my channel, where we are steadily making our way through William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. We're continuing with Act 1, Scene 5 today, so let's jump straight back in it, shall we? So the last time we looked at how the first scene introduces us to the Capulet-Montague feud in all its absurdity and volatility, and some of the key players, like Tybalt and Benvolio, and most of all, Romeo. The rest of Act 1 introduces us to more of the Capulet household, Lord Capulet in Scene 2, Lady Capulet, the nurse, and Juliet in Scene 3. We also learn that Juliet is kind of already spoken for because Paris wants to marry her and her family is not at all opposed to the idea. So there are already two things standing in the way of Romeo and Juliet's eventual relationship: the family feud and Paris. Scene 4 gives us some fun and levity with Mercutio's Queen Mab speech. For the full analysis on that, see my Patreon exclusive video, if you like, as well as some heavy-handed foreshadowing when Romeo says that he has a bad feeling about going to the Capulet ball. At the end of last week's video, we explored how Scene 5 opens with the hectic comings and goings of the servants in preparation for the party, which sets up a chaotic and lively atmosphere that both serves as build-up and contrast to the upcoming romantic moment between Romeo and Juliet. This video is not about that, however. We first have to talk about two other characters that play a prominent role in this scene and also this play: Tybalt and Lord Capulet. So let's take a look at that, shall we? Actually, before we talk about Lord Capulet in this scene, let's take a small step back and look at the impression we get of him when he's first introduced. So, like I said in the summary of Act 1, Scene 2 in last week's video, that scene has Lord Capulet and Paris talking about Paris's intention to marry Juliet. Perfectly normal for the time period. A man would ask the father for permission to marry his daughter. But here's how Lord Capulet responds. "My child is yet a stranger to this world. She hath not seen the change of 14 years. Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride." This is genuinely caring. Capulet thinks Juliet is too young to get married. And he's not wrong. Side note, I've seen people say that Juliet's age, her being so young, is what put them off the play. But here's the thing. Shakespeare wants you to be uncomfortable about how young she is. He highlights it over and over. Capulet brings it up here, and Lady Capulet and the nurse discuss it in the next one. Her age is kept firmly in the spotlight. And Juliet is the only character whose exact age we're told. We certainly get the impression that Romeo is young too, maybe 18 or even younger, but Shakespeare never confirms it. And that's deliberate. Romeo's age doesn't matter nearly as much as Juliet's does. Paris pushes back with, "Younger than she, a happy mother's maid." Basically, other girls her age are being married off, why shouldn't she? To which Capulet says, "And too soon marred are those so early made. The earth has swallowed all my hopes but she is the hopeful lady of my earth." He's staying firm. Marrying girls off too young can ruin them. And then we get something important. Juliet is his only living child. Any others that he and Lady Capulet have died, which sadly wasn't too uncommon in the 16th century. Infant mortality rates were high, as were maternal mortality rates. This part's a bit interpretive on my part, but I think it matters. The expectation for women in that time period would have been to fall pregnant as soon as they were married. In fact, it actually wasn't that uncommon for babies to be born 7 months after getting married, because, you were allowed to treat a fiancé as a wife. So the younger Juliet gets married, the younger she would be when she gets pregnant, and so the sooner her life would be put at risk. And I think Capulet knows that, and he wants to protect her. After all, she is the hopeful lady of his earth, meaning my only hope to carry on my genetic line, really. And I've seen people ask, if he doesn't want Juliet to get married, why doesn't he turn Paris down outright? First of all, he does want Juliet to get married, just not right at this moment. And second of all, socially speaking, he can't really afford to turn Paris down. Paris is a count, which means he has a very high social standing in Verona. There are far worse matches Lord Capulet could make for his only child. Marrying Paris would secure Juliet's position as one of the high standing wives in Verona, and it would also elevate Lord Capulet's social status. But here's the really unusual thing Capulet does in this conversation. He says that Paris should try and woo Juliet to get her heart in line 16 because, and I quote, "My will to her consent is but a part, and she agreed within her scope of choice, lies my consent and fair according voice." He's saying that Juliet's consent actually matters. And that wasn't something a father was required to consider in those days. If Capulet had wanted Juliet to marry Paris, he simply could have arranged it, and Juliet would have had no real say in the matter. But he gives her one. So yeah, in his introductory scene, Shakespeare gives us a pretty favorable impression of Lord Capulet, a father who's protective, thoughtful, and surprisingly progressive, given the time period, about his daughter's agency. Let's see if that impression holds now that we move into Act 1, Scene 5, shall we? So, when Lord Capulet comes on stage, he very much acts the genial host. He greets his guests warmly and encourages them to dance, though he excuses himself, claiming that he is too old for dancing. He even has a whole back and forth with his cousin about how long it's been since they last danced, which, truth be told, reminded me of a fair few of my own family gatherings when the older folks start to reminisce about the good old days, or how long it's been since little Timmy graduated high school, or something like that. So, in this first part of the scene, Lord Capulet presents himself as a friendly, older gentleman whose partying days are behind him. So far, so good, right? However, things start to shift the moment Tybalt spots Romeo. Like I said in the summary of last week's video, Tybalt recognizes Romeo by the sound of his voice and immediately sends his page for a sword. Now, when Lord Capulet gets wind of this, he's nowhere near as outraged as Tybalt is. In fact, he tells his nephew to calm down. "Content thee, gentle coz, let him alone." He doubles down on this a few lines later, telling Tybalt to take no note of him. Basically, ignore it, it's not worth the fight. He even compliments Romeo. Verona brags of him to be a virtuous and well-governed youth, he says. So not only is he refusing to start trouble, he's openly acknowledging that Romeo has a good reputation among Verona. And then he gives the practical reason for letting Romeo be. "I would not for the wealth of all this town here in my house do him disparagement." He knows that harming Romeo, especially at his own party, would be a massive social faux pas. It would make him look like an irrational, dishonorable host, not to mention that he's heard the prince's decree in Act 1, Scene 1. Remember, he was there at the fray. So he knows that it would have serious consequences for both him and Tybalt if either of them were to kill Romeo. And he is considerate of those things, because appearances and social standing matter to him. But the moment Tybalt pushes back, well, that's when Capulet's temper flares. And it flares fast. He goes from calm and authoritative to furious in seconds. "He shall be endured. What? Good man, boy, I say he shall. Go to. Am I the master here or you? Go to." This is Capulet pulling rank. "Am I the master here or you" is pretty self-explanatory, right? But "good man, boy" also shows that he's putting Tybalt in his place. Good man was a term for a man of a lower rank than a gentleman. So he's deliberately reminding Tybalt who has the authority here. And the repeated exclamation marks tell us that he's raising his voice, possibly even shouting. This is not polite irritation. This is outrage. And it's interesting to me how quickly Lord Capulet's fuse blows, because it tells us something else, but I'll come back to that in just a moment. When Tybalt still doesn't back down, Capulet fully loses his patience. He calls Tybalt a saucy boy in line 82, and saucy basically means rude, and a princox in line 85, which is an insolent, arrogant youth. And then he threatens him. "Be quiet, or for shame, I'll make you quiet." It's a pretty serious threat, especially at an event he's trying so hard to keep running smoothly. The chaos of this moment is made even clearer by the fact that Capulet keeps switching mid-rant to address his guests, "Well said, my hearts," or his servants, "More light, more light." He's desperately trying to maintain the image of the welcoming host while simultaneously tearing into Tybalt. It's frantic and messy, and it shows how overwhelmed Lord Capulet gets when someone challenges his authority. And here's where the short fuse I mentioned earlier comes back into play. Lord Capulet gets so, for lack of a better word, touchy because Tybalt isn't really supposed to talk back to him. Lord Capulet is the head of the household, which means he is the oldest male family member. And as such, he is supposed to have complete and utter authority over everybody else. Juliet as his daughter, of course, but Tybalt too. And yet, Tybalt refuses to fully submit to him. He eventually leaves, but he's still seething with rage when he does, and he swears to take revenge on Romeo, which he eventually does. This tells us that Lord Capulet's control over the members of his family isn't as complete as it's supposed to be. And that lack of control, it foreshadows exactly what's going to happen later. Tybalt will go on to start a duel with Romeo, as already mentioned, and Juliet will refuse him too when he tries to force her to marry Paris. This moment in Act 1, Scene 5 is the first crack we see in Capulet's authority. So overall, the impression we get of him is nuanced. On the one hand, Capulet can be warm and generous when everything goes as he wants and expects. On the other, his temper is explosive when people disobey him. And underneath all that, his power in his own household is much shakier than it looks. Alright, now that we've talked about Lord Capulet, let's take a look at the other character involved in this argument, Tybalt, and what we learn about him in the process. Let me start off by saying that Tybalt hasn't changed at all between his first appearance and this one. He's still ever the hot-headed aggressor who refuses to back down from any fight. I mean, he immediately gets enraged by Romeo's mere presence and immediately sends a page to fetch his sword in order to duel and or kill Romeo. And listen to what he says as soon as the page is gone. "What dares the slave come hither covered with an antic face?" That part just means he's wearing a mask. "To fleer and scorn at our solemnity. Now by the stock and honor of my kin, to strike him dead, I hold it not a sin." Just a fun side note here, before we get into the actual words and language that he uses, I always imagine this part being rumbled into an imaginary beard, which you can't really do in a stage production because you have to make sure the audience hears you. Now, let's talk language. First of all, he calls Romeo a slave, which is quite the insult when you think about it. He reveals here that he thinks of Romeo, and by extension all Montagues, as less than. It's dehumanizing, and it echoes the same classist attitude we've seen from Tybalt before, when he called the servants heartless hinds. By the way, it's not that I'm saying slaves are less than, it's that the word has that connotation because of the status that slaves had in society. They were literally viewed as lesser human beings. And just as an FYI, slavery was very much still a thing in 16th century England. Also, what Tybalt's speech reveals is that he cannot, for the life of him, fathom another reason as to why Romeo would be at this party other than to mock and scorn the Capulets. That's what to fleer and scorn means, to make fun of. Which, first of all, quite the projection, Tybalt, and second of all, not true. And if you're wondering what projection means at this point, it's when you assume somebody does something because that's what you yourself would do in that situation. In Tybalt's case, because he himself would only show up at a Montague party out of sheer hatred and spite, he assumes that's what Romeo is doing. However, we as the audience know that Romeo's only there because he wants to try and woo his beloved Rosaline. who isn't going to stay his beloved for long, but that's going to be next week's video's subject. So Romeo's motivation is love, but Tybalt assumes only hate. Once again, that juxtaposition of love and hate that we've already seen in the first scene of the play. And now for the last thing I want to mention about Tybalt's words. The lines, "Now for the stock and honor of my kin, to strike him dead, I hold it not a sin," are particularly telling, in my opinion. They tell us that Tybalt fully intends to kill Romeo without even a second thought. He does not even consider it a sin, even though "thou shalt not kill" is quite literally one of the 10 Commandments, a core Christian moral law, which is the faith Tybalt would have had given that the play is set in Italy. But because in Tybalt's mind, Romeo's presence is dishonoring the Capulet family name, he thinks he's justified. Here too, like in the opening scene before, we see this trait of toxic masculinity embodied in Tybalt. Honor is everything to him, and it needs to be defended through violence. Otherwise, he'd think himself less of a Capulet, and, by extension, less of a man. And again, just as an FYI, I'm not condoning Tybalt's actions. I'm just explaining them. And I don't think the narrative condones them either. After all, Tybalt dies as a result of his own actions. He vows revenge here. In lines 90 to 91, he says, "I will withdraw, but this intrusion shall, now seeming sweet, convert to bitterest gall." And then, in Act 3, Scene 1, he makes good on that vow by challenging Romeo to a duel. Actually, Tybalt and Mercutio challenge each other to a duel. Then Romeo steps in and tries to break them apart, but Tybalt stabs Mercutio under Romeo's arm, which leads to Mercutio dying. Then Romeo fights with Tybalt and stabs him, effectively killing him. Kind of, sort of, accidentally, maybe? Like, I don't think Romeo outright means to kill Tybalt in that duel. He's just very, very hurt and angry that Tybalt has just killed one of his best friends, which doesn't excuse his actions by any means, but it certainly makes them a tad more understandable, at least to me. But the reason Tybalt challenges Mercutio to a duel in the first place is simple. Mercutio's friends with Romeo and Benvolio, two of the Montagues. And Tybalt doesn't specifically swear revenge on Romeo in this scene, but on the entire house of the Montagues. So when Mercutio steps up, he becomes a stand-in for that. So this vow of revenge becomes directly responsible for Tybalt's death. And that, I think, makes him a cautionary tale, perhaps even a little bit of a warning to the audience. Almost like Shakespeare is saying, don't let your anger and pride get the best of you, or they will be your undoing. All right, now that we've looked at things from both Lord Capulet's and Tybalt's point of view, let's zoom out a little and take a look at this moment as a whole, and why it's thematically relevant to the play. There are two themes that are explored with this argument. The first is moderation versus impulsivity. Look at how Lord Capulet tries to handle the situation. He urges Tybalt to let Romeo be, to keep the peace. Yes, he loses his temper later when Tybalt disagrees with him, but his first instinct, his first response, is to show restraint. Tybalt, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. He doesn't have an ounce of restraint in his body. I mean, he literally threatens to kill Romeo on sight, which, if we think back to the opening scene, that kind of seems to be Tybalt's MO. He threatened to kill Benvolio too. And speaking of that moment in the opening scene, it literally represents the same theme. Benvolio advocated for showing restraint and keeping the peace, while Tybalt charged headfirst into the fight. Notice how Tybalt is being the common denominator? It's not the last time that's the case either. I've already talked about Act 3, Scene 1 in the last section, but we see the same dynamic crop up again, this time with Tybalt and Mercutio being the aggressors, and Romeo and Benvolio trying to hold them back. So it always plays out the same. One side tries to avoid unnecessary conflict, the other is quick to escalate it. I think it's easy to assume, given how often the peacekeepers fail and the instigators, quote unquote, win, that Shakespeare or even the play itself is on the aggressor's side. But look at the disastrous consequences it has every time a fight escalates. It almost always leads to death. And that's because the play is a tragedy. It's not meant to be a guidebook on how to live your life. If anything, it's meant to be a guidebook on how not to live your life. Next, we have the second theme, youth versus age. It's kind of an extension of the first theme. Age shows restraint while youth acts impulsively. This is something we see time and time again in this play. The rash and reactive decisions of the younger characters become the driving force in the tragedy. Romeo and Juliet fall head over heels in love and impulsively decide to get married. Mercutio acts on impulse when he keeps making jabs at Tybalt, eventually goading him into killing him. Romeo reacts on impulse when he stabs Tybalt in revenge. Juliet rather impulsively decides to fake her own death instead of telling her parents she's married to Romeo, which is why she can't marry Paris. And both Romeo and Juliet impulsively decide to kill themselves when they either think, in Romeo's case, or see, in Juliet's, that the other is dead. The younger characters consistently seem incapable of thinking through their actions, which brings about the tragedy. On the other hand, consider Lord Capulet in this scene. He's seeing the bigger picture, prioritizing the comfort of his guests and the smooth run of his party, as well as considering the social implications of having someone be killed at his ball, over any petty grievances he might have with the Montagues. He seems to have a foresight that the younger generation lacks, almost as if wisdom comes with age. However, I don't want anyone to take away from this that Romeo and Juliet would have had a better ending if they had just listened to their parents. That's not what I'm saying here. The older generation is as much responsible for the tragic outcome of the play as the younger generation is. After all, they've started the feud. That's the reason everyone hates each other so much, and why Romeo and Juliet's love is forbidden in the first place. So neither side is faultless. It's just that temper seems to fade with age. Possibly because you simply don't have the energy to get worked up over so many things anymore. Alright, time to wrap this bad boy up. Lord Capulet is presented as a nuanced character. Initially, he is cast in a very positive light. He's protective of Juliet while also giving her a surprising degree of agency, but in his argument with Tybalt, our perception shifts a little. We see his temper flare when his authority is challenged. This foreshadows his loss of composure when faced with Juliet's disobedience in Act 3, Scene 5. Tybalt is a static character, and that's not a bug, that's a feature. His characterization is supposed to remain the same. That's his fatal flaw. So he's still very much a hot-tempered aggressor who wants to kill Romeo on sight for the perceived transgression of mocking the Capulets at their own party, which is a complete and utterly wrong assumption on Tybalt's part. The argument between him and Lord Capulet reveals two more of the play's larger themes: moderation versus impulsivity, and youth versus age. The latter is almost an extension of the first one. Youth acts impulsively and therefore drives the plot forward, directly leading to the tragic ending, while age is more moderate and more tempered in comparison. Next week, we're finally gonna start talking about Romeo and Juliet's first meeting. I'll first focus on Romeo's reaction to when he first sees Juliet before we discuss their first conversation. For now, this is me, signing off. Lost my script. Too many words in my script. Also, this is a very long sentence. What? Mistake in my script. Act 2, Scene 2 is the famous balcony scene. Now, Parish. Yeah, no, he does perish. Thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, share, and comment down below. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you don't want to miss any of my future videos. I also have a Patreon that you can subscribe to, starting at as little as $2 a month, which gives you early access to any of my videos. Higher tiers include access to exclusive Patreon-only content and the chance to suggest books, plays, or poems for any future analysis. For now, that is it from me, and I'll see you next time.